Welcome back. This is Billy with Wolf River Music Television. And once again, thank you for tuning in to our channel. Now today, we're going to continue with some of our unfinished thoughts from last time. Now, if you remember from last episode, we started off talking about Cass Elliot. We talked about the house that she lived in for the last 7 years of her life. And we also talked about a lot of the friends that she had during that time period. Some of whom were a good and positive influence, others not so much. And then that discussion took us off into a completely different direction, based on some of the connections that these certain people had, or with the dealings that they may have had with a certain element of the local population of the Los Angeles area, some of whom, it turns out, may have been guilty of some very unsavory behavior. And so that led us into some discussions about some very specific people in particular who may not have necessarily gone down in history as familiar names, but they have certainly been shown to have been associated with some of our history's most infamous people. And so today, in this episode, we're going to continue to talk about the very well-known music producer, Terry Melcher, who he was, and what kind of a role he may have played in all of this. And, unfortunately, Charles Manson and the various members of the Manson family cannot be ignored in this story. Although, it would be nice to think that someday, hopefully maybe in the future, he and his story will eventually be forgotten. And everything that they did will finally be tossed into the dustbins of irrelevant history. John Phillips is going to come up again, although not necessarily in a good way. And then eventually, we're going to finally make our way back over to Cass Elliot once again. And we're going to talk about how she got herself mixed up in this whole difficult and complicated storyline. And that includes talking about some of these friendships that she had. Who were these people? And why were they hanging around with her? So let's just go ahead and jump right into this. So, who was Terry Melcher? Well, in short, he was a very well-known and a very successful Hollywood music producer. He made his name in the very early days by working with bands such as Paul Revere and the Raiders, and in the mid-60s he was also the producer on the first two Byrds albums, and he was very instrumental in helping that band to achieve their very unique sound back in those days. So what's the big deal about him? Well, let's talk about it. First of all, who was he? As I just said, music producer, right? So what? Big deal. Well, from everything that I have read about him and some of the work that I've certainly become familiar with over the years, especially with the Byrds, he seemed like he was very good at what he did. He seemed like he was very creative, innovative, but he also had a big leg up on all of his competition for a couple of very good reasons. His mother was actress Doris Day. So Terry Melcher was born into wealth, and he had all the right connections that he needed from a very young age to be able to break into his field in Hollywood. So again, how does he fit into this story? Let's fast forward now to about the summer of 1968. And at this point, other than the bands that we've already mentioned, he was also working with the Mamas and the Papas. And so, of course, naturally, he was good friends with Cass Elliot. He also was very good friends with the members of the Beach Boys, especially Dennis Wilson. Now, if you remember from a couple of videos back, we talked quite extensively about Dennis Wilson and his unfortunate connections to certain members of the Manson family, especially Charles Manson. We talked about the fact that at some point Charles Manson had figured out a way to talk Dennis Wilson into letting him and about 20, possibly maybe even as many as 30 at any given point in time, members of the Manson family to use Dennis Wilson's 8,000 square foot mansion, which is located kind of over in the West Sunset Boulevard area. I don't know if that's Bel Air, Pacific Palisades, whatever that area is over there. Anyway, it's a very big house, and Dennis Wilson had a lot of money, so it's a very nice house. Well, they were basically using that as a crash pad, and that went on for several months until the point of where it started to get way out of hand. In fact, just a little side note to let you know just how crazy things were getting over there. Probably the last straw for Dennis Wilson was when Charles Manson stole some cash from him and then went to some small town out in the rural outskirts of Los Angeles and bought a cow, an actual cow. Brought the animal back on some kind of a trailer or in the back of a truck. Brought the animal into Dennis Wilson's house. And that pretty much was it. At that point, Dennis Wilson had lost control of that situation, and because he was outnumbered by about 30-1 by these people, he just basically had to flee his own house and then got the sheriff involved and ran him out of the place. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's back up to Terry Melcher again. So Dennis Wilson was under the influence of Charles Manson in a big way. And as we've also spoken at great length, Charles Manson fancied himself as a legitimate musician. Like I said earlier, he wrote songs, he played the guitar, he even sang. And he wanted to break into the Hollywood music scene really bad. And he would use any way he possibly could, any connection that he could find, especially with someone as powerful as Dennis Wilson or Neil Young or Cass Elliot or any number of about 8 or 10 other really big names that I could name, but I won't. I don't want to digress. So Dennis Wilson introduced Charles Manson to Terry Melcher, big-time music producer, invited Melcher to come over to his house in Bel Air to listen to Charles Manson sing some of his songs. Well, like I've already said about Melcher, he knew what he was doing. He had a good ear. He was not impressed. But Dennis Wilson pressured him on this one. And this went on for several months. And we're talking about probably the summer of 1968, all the way probably till about the end of that year, maybe into about January of 1969. Well, there are rumors that Melcher even invited Manson, reluctantly, into a studio somewhere in West Hollywood and actually recorded him. But those tapes are nowhere to be found. They probably were erased or destroyed. Anyway, at some point, Terry Melcher finally got the courage up to either directly say to Charles Manson he was not interested, or he just said it to Dennis Wilson. Now, on another side note, Terry Melcher's girlfriend at the time was actress Candice Bergen. They both lived at the house at 10050 Cielo Drive. Yep, that's where they lived. And according to Candice Bergen, in many interviews, she has stated several times that Charles Manson was at that house during that summer and into the fall of 1968, no less than 6 times, possibly even many more times when she just wasn't around. Tex Watson was also another person who she saw at the house. She didn't like them. They gave her the creeps. So she told Terry Melcher that she didn't appreciate them being over. She also didn't appreciate the fact that sometimes there were even Manson family members swimming in the pool, which could have included Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, or possibly Linda Kasabian. Who knows? There were so many of them. But they definitely had visited that house. Now, to sum all of that up, sometime probably, like I said, around the end of 1968 or very early 1969, Terry Melcher finally got the courage up to say he wasn't interested. Charles Manson was a creep, and he didn't want to record his music. Well, as you can imagine, Charles Manson was absolutely enraged by this news when he found out. So what happened after that is very crucial to not only this part of the story, but the rest of the story that we're going to talk about. Sometime in January of 1969, Terry Melcher and his girlfriend Candice Bergen were awoken in the middle of the night by a stereo, the record player in the house, being turned on at full blast, probably like at about 2 o'clock in the morning, for no apparent reason. Somebody had come in the house and turned it on. Now, other incidents happened. For example, they were woken in the middle of the night on a couple of occasions to the sound of someone possibly out in the front yard running around, knocking over patio furniture, and there was a very expensive telescope that belonged to Terry that was stolen off of the front porch. Now, this went on, like I said, for about a month, maybe 6 or 8 weeks, until finally he started to get paranoid. He knew that something was going on and somebody was getting onto the property. How? Remember, you've seen pictures of the gate. I'm sure they probably kept the gate locked. But as the old saying goes, where there's a will, there's a way. Especially if that will happens to be a psychotic one. Now, if you know the story about what happened in the early morning hours on August 9th, 1969, when 4 members of the Manson family, not 3, there were 4, Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and another, Linda Kasabian, who did not take part in the murders. She stayed out on the driveway, and she is also the one who ratted the rest of them out and avoided prison time because of that plea deal bargain that she made for telling the authorities what happened. They got onto the property not by going through the gate or climbing over it. They went around it. According to court testimony from all 4 of the perpetrators who had been on the property that night in August, they all stated that standing on the outside of the fence looking towards the property on the road, that they all went to the right. They climbed up an embankment just maybe 10 or 12 feet to the point of where the main part of the fence gave way to just a few strands of barbed wire. And it was at that point that they went through the barbed wire. It certainly didn't stop them, and it wouldn't stop anybody else. The gate would stop a car from getting onto the property. But anyone on foot who was determined could easily get in there. And so they did. About the only thing that happened was I think one of them stated that she got her clothes caught on some of the barbed wire and tore her pants. That was about it. Anyway, like I said, I don't want to digress. Back to Terry Melcher and Candice Bergen. After several of these incidents happened, Terry Melcher finally got to the point where he said to Candice Bergen, "We're moving." She said, "Okay, at the end of the month?" And his answer back was, "No, tomorrow. We're leaving tomorrow." Truck showed up the next day, packed up all their stuff, and brought it over to a house that his mother, Doris Day, owned in Malibu. He was very discreet about that move. He didn't want anybody to know where he was going. He tried his best to keep that on the down low. He didn't want anyone to know where he lived. Why? He was scared out of his mind. He already had a hunch that Charles Manson was a freak and a weirdo. And now he was scared for his own safety. So he left the house at 10050 Cielo Drive sometime between about the 5th of January and possibly maybe even the 15th of January. And the reason why we don't have a specific date for when he and Candice Bergen moved out of the house is because even Terry Melcher himself in court documents claimed that he didn't even remember the exact date that he moved out. So what it sounds like to me is that they just up and left in a haste. Now, here's where it even gets a little more creepy. We're not even done yet with Terry Melcher's part of the story. Just because he moved out doesn't mean that that was the last time that he had any dealings with Charles Manson and the rest of the Manson family. In fact, somehow Charles Manson, probably just by asking around and snooping around, found out where Terry Melcher and Candice Bergen were living in Malibu, traveled there, and actually left a handwritten note on the front porch. I have no idea what was in the note, but I imagine that it probably was asking him again to allow him to audition or to come and listen to him play songs. Manson was absolutely determined to get a recording contract, and he was dead set on the idea that Terry Melcher was going to produce an album for him. He wouldn't take no for an answer. And I also think that Terry Melcher was probably, again, very afraid of the repercussions if he turned him down. He just couldn't figure out how to say no. So he agreed to again listen to Charles Manson play his songs. And this time, he actually even traveled all the way out to Spahn Ranch to do that. Now, just so you know, that's a really long drive from Hollywood. It's way the flip up on the northwest corner of the San Fernando Valley. Not really necessarily that easy to just get to in a few minutes. That was probably about an hour drive for him to get out there. And at that point, again, he was surrounded by the entire rest of the Manson family and probably extremely uncomfortable. In court testimony, he describes what he saw, and it sounds pretty frickin' creepy. And in the end, he turned him down again. But this time, what he said was he asked Charles Manson if he was a member of any local musicians' unions. And of course, the answer to that was no. And so he told Manson that, well, because of that, you're not going to be allowed to record in any of the professional studios around Los Angeles because they're just not going to work with you. And of course, Manson, being the person that he was, said that he had no interest in belonging to any kind of a musician's union. And so Melcher had an out. He said, well, then I'm sorry, you're just not going to be able to record and I'm not going to be able to work with you. And fortunately for Terry Melcher, that was the last meeting they had. That was in May of 1969. Okay, so let's get ourselves back on a solid timeline just to cut down on the confusion, jumping back and forth from date to date during this time period between 1968 and 1969. So we know that Melcher moved out of the house on Cielo Drive sometime, like I said, probably in the middle of January. So even Melcher himself didn't remember that date, even when he was pressed during his court testimony. So nobody knows. And you know what? It doesn't make any difference. But we do know for a fact that Tate and Polanski moved into the house on the 15th of February, 1969. As a matter of fact, we know that they signed the lease on February 12th, 1969, and then moved into the house 3 days later, because that's documented. Now, if you will remember from just a couple of videos back, I talked at great length about a party that happened at the house on Cielo Drive, and it even had a very specific date. It was on March 15th, 1969, and it was the day before Polanski was due to fly to Rio de Janeiro in order to start working on the film The Day of the Dolphin, which, by the way, he never finished, in case you go look it up and see that his name is not attached to it. He didn't finish it for obvious reasons because of what happened in August of 1969. Anyway, the party that was held was basically just sort of like a housewarming party. that Tate and Polanski wanted to have basically just an excuse to bring all of their very well-known, famous, wealthy friends over to the house. It was a big Hollywood party. It happened all the time. But that's not the important thing that I want to talk about. So take a look at what I said. Instead of me just saying it all again right here, let's just roll the film from last time. Here it is. Take a look. Really about the only significant thing that I really want to point out here is that this time period, very specific time period, March of 1969. In terms of what we're talking about, this was a very pivotal moment in time for a couple of reasons. Other than just the events of this party, there was a much more creepy and sinister incident that took place just a few days after this party, and after Roman Polanski had temporarily left the country and left Sharon Tate here by herself to be cared for by her friends. What I really want to bring to your attention is an incident that happened on the property at Cielo Drive on March 23rd, 1969, just a little bit over a week after that party. It's because of the incident that happened on that date that launched hundreds of different types of theories about Charles Manson and his motives and why he would even think or consider to order a hit on these people at this address. Did he know them? Did he know who lived in the house? Obviously, he knew that Terry Melcher had lived in the house. And as we've already made clear, not only did he know that Melcher moved out, he eventually found out where Melcher lived. But that's not really the point. The question is, why did he order his people to travel to this house and, in his own words, destroy everyone in the house and to make it as gruesome as absolutely possible? Which they did. So let me just go ahead and explain what happened, and then you can come to your own conclusions about why you think things turned out the way that they did. Okay, so here's the scene. It's March 23rd, 1969, at the Tate Polanski house. Roman Polanski is not in the country. He's been gone for roughly about a week. Sharon Tate is home. Now, she hired a photographer who she had worked with many times before. Now, forgive me if I don't pronounce his name correctly. Sharok Hatami, and he was born in Iran. Now, he had worked with Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate many times before. In fact, again, in court testimony, he claimed that he worked with them possibly as much as 2 times a week. So Mr. Hatami claims that he was inside the house looking out one of the front living room windows when he spotted a man who he did not immediately recognize walking across the front yard, sort of looking around as if he were trying to find someone. Well, he later identified the man from a police lineup as Charles Manson. So he had been inside the house setting up camera equipment. He went outside and asked the man who he was, what he wanted. Well, Manson said, "I'm looking for Terry Melcher." Well, Mr. Hatami was a photographer and worked in Hollywood, but he had no idea who Terry Melcher was. So what he said was, well, there's no one that lives here by this name. This is the Polanski house. Maybe the people that you're looking for are over in the guest house. Now, take a look at the map here so you'll know where the guest house is. Here's the main house. Here's a swimming pool. And if you just go like another 50 feet down, well, there's the guest house. Okay, so Manson goes to the guest house. At that point, Manson meets up with the actual owner of the house, Rudolph Altobelli. Now, a few things that you need to know about him, and here's a photo of him. He was a Hollywood talent manager. The reason that he was at the house and staying at the guest house, other than the fact that he owned the property, was because he was due to fly to Rome the very next day to do whatever it was that he did. He had some work to do there. Well, Altobelli had already met Manson, probably at least 2 times. He had probably met him at Dennis Wilson's house, and he had also probably seen him over at the Cielo Drive house during the many times that Manson had been there visiting Terry Melcher. So Altobelli already did not like Manson, and again, like a lot of other people, viewed him as strange, creepy, and weird. Now, Altobelli was also not happy that Manson had showed up at the house and asked, "Did you bother the people in the main house?" Well, we don't really know exactly all of the things that were exchanged, but what we do know, according to Altobelli's testimony, is that he told Manson to get off the property. Now, a shouting match ensued, and as Manson was exiting, Altobelli followed after him, and they were continuing to argue with one another as this was going on. Now, here's where things get a little hazy based on the descriptions that were given in court from these 2 different men, Mr. Altobelli versus Mr. Hatami. Hatami says that the only people that were in the main house were him and Sharon Tate. Altobelli said no, the others were there as well, including Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski. And during that exchange, where Manson was exiting the property, by the way, on foot, there was no car parked in the driveway that Charles Manson had brought there. And in those days, he was driving a 1952 Continental Bakery Hostess Twinkie truck. So it would have been pretty obvious if there had been a Hostess Twinkie truck parked in the driveway. There was not. Which brings us back to what I was talking about earlier. How were people getting onto the property? The gate was electric and it was opened with a buzzer button or from the inside. So how did he get on the property? Probably exactly the same way that we described earlier, by going around it and going through the barbed wire fence. Either way, here is why it doesn't make any difference what theories people come up with, because it's all essentially based on conflicting reports. Was Jay Sebring there? Was Wojciech Frykowski there? Was Abigail Folger there? Obviously Sharon Tate was there. Now, Hatami stated that only Tate was there. Altobelli said no, the other people were there, and that they came out of the front door onto the front porch and witnessed what was happening. Now, again, if you were exiting someone else's property in haste and you were being run off by the angry owner and he was yelling at you and you were yelling back at him, does it make any sense that you would stop and scan and take a look at all the faces that were there? We don't know. Maybe he did. And while we're at it, take a look at this. Who do you think took this photograph and on what date? You're right. This was taken by Shirok Hatami on March 23rd, 1969, right at the front gate of the Cielo Drive property. That's obviously Sharon Tate on the bicycle in the front. Guess who that is behind her? That's Abigail Folger. So she was definitely there on that day at some point. And if she was there, Wojciech Frykowski was probably most definitely there too. Again, speculation. We just don't know the full picture. What time of day was this? Don't know. All of the people that were there obviously saw what was going on, but we just don't know if Manson saw the other people. And even if he did he know them? Did he know who lived in the house on a regular or a semi-regular basis? Also, the question is, did he even know who Sharon Tate was? She was obviously the famous one. But did Charles Manson go to the movies very often? Did he watch television? I don't think he did. So there's a possibility that he may have recognized her, maybe from a magazine. But did he really know who she was? That's a good question. So again, let's just go ahead and make the assumption that all of them were there and that Manson saw all of them. He still doesn't know who's a house guest and who's actually living in the house on a permanent basis. So when he gave those instructions to Tex Watson to travel to the house that Terry Melcher used to live in and destroy everyone who was inside. We just don't know if Manson knew who was going to be in the house, and that's the bottom line. There are so many unanswered questions, and theories about what he knew or didn't know are always based on conflicting reports. Okay, let's bring it all in here and try to consolidate some of this huge amount of information that we've been talking about. So why do I keep harping on these questions about what Manson knew about the residents of this house after Terry Melcher moved out? Well, there is a reason for this. It's because I'm trying to dispel some of the many rumors that still persist to this day, that somehow the crimes that were committed here at the house on Cielo Drive were drug-related, or that the people who were living there at that time were specifically targeted for some valid reason. And when I say valid, I mean in the way that Charles Manson would have defined that word at that time. And for my final hypothesis, I'm not going to just speculate or just come to my own personal conclusions, but rather I'm going to use the actual words and the court testimony from two of the people who were directly involved, the people who were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison for these horrific crimes, plus even other murders that we're not even going to talk about. But before we wrap this part of the story up and get to those conclusions, I want to bring in someone else who up to this point I have not yet even mentioned. Now, I was debating with myself whether or not I even wanted to bring him up at all. But historically speaking, he was involved, and he too was an unfortunate victim of these crimes. The person I'm talking about, of course, is Stephen Parent, who was the youngest victim of this Manson family murder crime spree. And I just felt like some of his story needed to be told and that he wasn't ignored. And so for us to be able to better understand Stephen Parent's story and how he fits into this whole sad and utterly senseless crime that took place here, we need to know what he was doing here. We need to know why he was here. And so to do that, we need to back up again, back up to the front gate of this house and how the perpetrators got themselves onto the property and then what they did immediately after they got themselves in. So many of you will already know some of the details about what they did when they got here. But for those of you that don't, let me briefly just explain. The first thing that happened was that they drove the car right up here in front of the gate. Next to the gate is a mailbox. Next to the mailbox is a telephone pole. Tex Watson was given very specific instructions from Manson to cut the telephone lines that led from that telephone pole into the house. And so he pulled the car up, stood on the hood, and then climbed up that pole and did exactly that. After the telephone lines were cut, they took the car back down to the bottom of the hill and parked it right here, and then walked back up with their knives and a change of clothing. When they got back to the gate, they threw their clothing over the top and onto the other side, being very careful not to touch it, because they were under the impression that if they did, that it could possibly set off an alarm inside the house. That wasn't exactly true, but they didn't know that. So, as we discussed earlier, they climbed up the embankment that's right onto the side, the right side of the gate, if you were looking into the property. And then at that point, as the hill begins to move up, the fence just kind of goes into the hill. And then from that point on, all there was just 3 or 4 strands of barbed wire. And of course, as we've already discussed, that's how they got onto the property. They traversed across the side of the hill for probably 30 or 35 feet through the brush, and then made their way back down to the driveway area right about here. It probably wasn't really that hard to do, especially for people who were as young as they were in their early 20s. Okay, first we're going to talk a little bit about what you see in these photos. I want you to get a good idea of the layout of the property and where the various different houses and buildings are located. So what's so significant about this little spot on the ground that's in the circle? So right there is where the electric gate button is. That's where you would pull up, roll your window down, push the button, and the gate would open for you. This is at the point where they met up with the young man, 18-year-old boy, Stephen Parent, who was trying to exit the property. Now, I have not spoken of him at all yet in any of these videos. There's lots of reasons why. He didn't know anybody in the house. He certainly didn't know Sharon Tate. He was there on the property visiting the other young man who lived in the guest house. He was the boy that basically took care of the pool and mowed the lawn. He was there trying to sell some kind of an electric alarm clock, which he was not successful in doing because the other young man was not interested in buying it. He was trying to get money to buy pot. That's why he was there. He is essentially the victim of the absolute worst timing ever. And I'm not saying that to try to be funny. He was literally in the worst place at the worst possible time. And if Stephen Parent had left that property just 3 minutes earlier, he would have been able to escape being murdered. And so Stephen Parent is unsuccessful in his attempt to sell this clock radio to his friend William Garretson. So he uses the phone in the house to make a call to another friend, possibly in an attempt to go somewhere else and try to do the same thing. Immediately after the phone call, he says goodbye and then starts to make his way back to the parking area where Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Sharon Tate have all parked their cars for the evening. Now, he's actually a little bit impaired at this point because he's just spent the last half hour drinking beer and possibly even smoking a little pot with his friend William Garretson. So when he gets back to his car, he gets into the white 1966 Nash Ambassador that belongs to his father, starts it up, and then promptly backs it right into the split rail fence that's along the edge of the driveway. Now, no one actually saw that happen, but the investigators know that it was him because there was some damage to the back of the car as well as some white paint from the fence. And again, speaking of timing, no one knows if Stephen Parent got out of his car at that point to go back around to take a look at the damage that he had just done to the fence and to his father's car, or if possibly maybe he just never planned to come back to that house ever again and then just decided to leave without saying anything to anyone, hoping that no one would know that he was the one that had done that. Again, we just don't know because no one saw it happen. But it comes back to this issue of just really bad timing because he arrived at that electric gate button at the absolute worst possible time. Tex Watson, during cross-examination during his trial, described that event like this. He had just emerged from the bushes, saw headlights coming towards him, which of course was Stephen Parent's car. He told the other 3 women to stay down and to stay back behind in the bushes. He confronted Stephen Parent as he was rolling down his window, attempting to reach his arm out to push the button to open the gate. That was when Tex Watson yelled, "Halt," at Stephen Parent. Now, without going into all of the gruesome details, let's just say this. Tex Watson was armed with a .22 caliber pistol in his right hand and a large knife in his left hand. He slashed Parent on the arm as Parent raised his arm in a defensive gesture as he saw the knife coming towards him. And then Tex Watson callously and cruelly shot the boy 4 times in the chest, rapid fire, most likely killing him basically instantly. Now, take a look at the photo again. The X is actually where Stephen Parent's car was found the next day. Now, why was it there? Well, because immediately after Watson shot Parent, Watson basically put the upper portion of his body into the car. He turned off the ignition, turned off the lights, and then put the car into neutral. And then for some unexplained reason decided that he needed to push the car backwards about 30 feet. So he cut the wheel and pushed the car to this spot right here, which is where, like I said, Parent in his automobile was found the next day. Then all four of them proceeded to the house. And, well, that's where I'm going to end that portion of the details, because there's no reason to go into what happened next. They went in through a window. Watson cut the screen, went in, opened the front door, let the others in, and, well, the rest is well documented in thousands of other places. And if you want to know the rest of the story, well, then you can look it up yourself. We don't need to go into those details here.